Little shocked no one has brought up Playground by Aron Beauregard.
Huh?
As the introduction hopefully illustrated, Playground by Aron Beauregard might have been the single most discussed book in my first Disturbing Book videos comments section. Opinions ranged from praise, to lukewarm acceptance, to outright hatred, to sadistic wishes for me to suffer through it. I have no direct way of measuring it, but it's possible that Playground is also the most currently discussed book in the extreme horror splatterpunky space. I've even seen people requesting that the Creepcast guys read it, and while I would pay money to hear Wendigoon say half of the lines in this book, I doubt they ever will. In that original video, I ranked The Slob, another book by Aron Beauregard, at number 10. My comprehensive thoughts are contained there, but while I didn't hate the book, I didn't like it either. A lot of people didn't hesitate to tell me that Playground is way better, and others obviously told me that Playground is just as bad, if not worse. Well, to resolve that difference of opinion, I decided to read it myself and see what I thought. Now, I'm going to admit up front that I really was willing to give this book a chance. The comments genuinely had swayed me to think that maybe the book would be good, so I was completely open to giving it an honest shot, and hopefully letting it surprise me. So my overall opinion, as I'm sure my tone is suggesting here, is that I thought it was pretty good. I bet you thought I was going to say that I hated it. Nah, I liked it well enough. I had some issues with it, and I'll discuss all of my thoughts on it, but overall, my opinion on Playground is pretty positive. For some background, Playground was written by Aron Beauregard and was released in 2022, 3 years after The Slob. It has been repeatedly sold to me as Saw, but with kids, which is pretty accurate. I'll give a rough plot and character description here, because my thoughts about Playground as a whole are mostly centered around those topics, but I want to say a couple things first. If you like content like this, I would highly recommend subscribing to my YouTube channel. I primarily do videos on philosophy and dark fiction, with some wildcard videos here and there, and I try to make every video nuanced, challenging, thought-provoking, and interesting. Also, I just hit 10,000 subscribers, and in celebration of that, and as a way to engage with more of you, the viewers, I'll be doing a Q&A comment reaction video. Ask me questions about the videos, philosophy, books, movies, whatever. And especially give me some hot takes you want to share. I would love to read your strong opinions, especially philosophical ones. Think Nietzsche is overrated, or that Jordan Peterson is the greatest philosopher ever, or that moral realism is true? Tell me that, and just add 10k to the comment so I know it's specifically for that video. I'm also going to issue a content warning for basically everything here. Playground is really nasty in every way, especially because of the book's villain, who is just, oh god. This stuff will be discussed, though critically, not sensationally, but if that's too much for you, maybe save this video for later. Prioritize yourself. Anyways, I've got some Dead Space Remake gameplay on for the background, since this is a more chill video and mostly a review, though I do get pretty analytical when discussing the book's villain. With that said, we can get into the plot of Playground. The book opens with Rock, a large, brutish man, as he observes Caroline, an abusive mother, and her son Donnie. He is attempting to recruit them for what is ostensibly a charitable purpose. We then cut to two other families, the Grimleys, consisting of Father Tom and Mother Molly, with the children Sadie, Samantha, and Isaac, as well as the Matthews family, consisting of Father Greg, Mother Lacey, and children Bobby, Tanya, CJ, and Kip. Tom and Molly Grimley are really good people, and loving parents. Their children, Sadie and Samantha, are stated to be somewhat mean to their brother Isaac, but it doesn't really come up much. Greg Matthews is the worst. He is a completely narcissistic and competitive sports dad who refuses to see any worth in his children outside of their potential as athletes. His wife Lacey, while still not a great parent, is stated to be good enough to where she is able to cool some of Greg's worst impulses. Bobby, Greg and Lacey's oldest son, is not an athlete, so he is despised by Greg, and Bobby channels that fatherly contempt into bullying and further abuse for others. CJ is Greg's star child, a capable athlete and leader, though he's aware of his father's despicable nature. He has a sweet kinship with his little sister Tanya, a very intelligent child. Then there is Kip, the youngest, who is kind of caught in the middle of the goodness and badness within his family. Finally, Geraldine is the abusive mother of Donnie. She burns him with cigarettes, keeps him on a leash, and shockingly has his tongue cut out. Those three families have been invited by Rock to the manor of Geraldine Borden to test out some advanced playground equipment designed by her assistant, Dr. Fuchs. They all receive their invites and begin making their way to the manor. We are then given an actual introduction to Geraldine and Dr. Fuchs. They immediately have terrible vibes, and it's pretty clear that the charitable veneer is hiding something darker. Geraldine and Dr. Fuchs speak in supremacist language and are extremely verbally abusive to Rock. In fact, just a few chapters later, we are shown the true depths of Geraldine's depraved mind. I'll return to this later because I have massive issues with this part, but Geraldine is shown to physically and sexually abuse Rock, who, by the way, is her adopted son. Gross. As I just said, Geraldine is a depraved physical, mental, and sexual abuser who is hosting the families at the playground. Dr. Fuchs, we learn, is a former Nazi scientist and designer of the death trap playground equipment. Rock is the abused, though now fully grown, adopted son of Geraldine, who initially goes along with her plans out of fear, but has some goodness in his heart. Alright, now the rapid fire of the plot. The families arrive and everything seems fine, though Geraldine and Donnie are late. The parents are taken to a viewing room separately from their kids and are made to sit in chairs. These chairs have a locking mechanism that straps them to the chair, and Lacey, unfortunately, leans forward right as the mechanism is engaged, which kills her when the metal clamp goes through her neck. Then Geraldine and Donnie finally arrive, and Rock, recognizing bits of himself in the abused Donnie, immediately kills Geraldine and takes Donnie to the playground room. There, the playground starts. The kids are attacked by dogs, and both dogs are killed, though only one death is featured on page. The kids are brutalized non-fatally, and then CJ takes control of the group, much to Bobby's chagrin. The first child to die is Samantha, who is blown up and then crushed under a lowering ceiling. After some other stuff, Kip falls into a meat grinder and dies. Isaac is blamed for Kip's death by Greg, who's watching in the viewing room, and by Bobby, both of them believing he took too long on the trap, causing Kip to fall. At this point, Greg has completely snapped. He is fully in on the brutal traps, and views it as another way for him to prove his family's superiority and athletic, competitive prowess. This is shown in the next death, where the children must go down a slide with retracting saw blades. Bobby and Sadie are the last ones at the top of the slide, and Greg uses the single intercom hint the parents are given to tell Bobby to use his natural skateboarding ability, something Greg previously despised about his oldest son. Bobby, seeing this as a chance to make his father proud, stabs Sadie and uses her body as a skateboard to go down the saw slide. She does not survive. In the next trap, where the children face falling into a vat of acid, Bobby initially tries to kill Isaac, but Isaac, sensing his inevitable doom, takes himself and Bobby into the acid where they both melt. Then, on a seesaw trap, CJ, who by now the readers will absolutely love, is unfortunately killed by a whirring blade, slicing his head in half. At this point, the only remaining children are Donnie and Tanya. Rock, who has been morally struggling throughout the entire book, stops the games, as he is now faced with the almost guaranteed loss of his surrogate self, Donnie. He then kills Dr. Fuchs by smashing his head into the controls and electrocuting him. The adults are released, and Greg immediately tries to kill Tom, but Rock kills Greg instead. By the way, Tom and Molly have by now lost all of their children, yet remain tenacious because they want to save the lives of Tanya and Donnie. Then Rock finds and kills Geraldine in a certain way, and then Tom and Molly, with Tanya and Donnie, escape, while Rock, who was severely wounded by gunshots from Geraldine, stays behind and succumbs to his wounds. Alright, there's the plot. Now we can move into the critique and review of the book. I'll begin with things I like, move into one part I disliked, centered around Geraldine, go into more stuff I liked, and then I'll go into a final, slightly more analytical critique of Geraldine once more. First, Playground obviously deals with extreme violence directed at the children, and while it was very, very gruesome and probably too much for most people, I think it was also handled very empathetically. It never felt like it was edgy purely for the sake of being edgy, save for one aspect I'll get to at the end. Like, yes, obviously it is edgy, but there was enough emotional, character, and thematic weight to keep it from feeling pointless. Others will disagree, but I appreciated this. Children in horror media will always cause people to flinch, I think, and thus I can appreciate that this book took extra care to specifically and consistently direct empathy at the children. Sometimes it faltered, like the Grimly daughters not being characterized enough, but overall I found Playground to be an empathetic book. I also thought the characterization, again save for the Grimly daughters, was generally pretty good, and as a reader, I think I felt exactly how I was supposed to feel towards each and every character. I particularly enjoyed CJ, Rock, and Greg. I liked CJ because, as a member of the Matthews family, I expected him to be terrible, but his eventual leadership role and empathetic actions helped to keep the narrative morally aligned and helped to keep the book grounded. I say it kept the book grounded because if every Matthews ended up being despicable in some way or another, Playground would have been reduced to a kind of surreal good versus evil nightmare world. I'll return to the book's dreamlike quality later, but for now, while some characters are obviously good and some characters are obviously evil, CJ showed that these aren't essential characteristics in Playground, they are choices, and thus, Playground felt less like a bizarro cartoon world where nothing matters, and more like a horrific scenario where realistic, grounded characters are unfortunately shoved into. Rock can be seen as one of the emotional cores of the book, and I think this is truly remarkable, because Rock is complicit in a lot of atrocities, both shown and implied. In fact, given his eventual stopping of the Playground at the end, we are forced to see Rock as a kind of morally guilty bystander for nearly all of the deaths in the book. And yet, Beauregard brought Rock to life as a conditioned, abused person that struggled with fear of his abuser and a genuine sense of morality, and ultimately, the moral side of him won. It's compelling, and I felt that the book was comfortable dwelling in the nuance of Rock being both a villain and ultimately a sufficient enough hero. I'll talk more about Greg later, but I like him because his overt narcissism and rabid competitive side show someone who is basically just like Geraldine, but happened to be in a situation where, for most of his life, his true personality was hampered by various forces. And when his wife Lacey, his final restraint, is gone, the true evil comes out. He has the same lack of empathy as Geraldine, the same instrumental attitude towards the children, and a similar level of sadism, except it's through his ego rather than his sexuality, as it is for Geraldine, who I did not like. Aww. There were a couple reasons I didn't especially love Geraldine. I'll go into one reason here, and that's about how her scenes relate to the plot's development. After that, I'll return to stuff that I like, and then follow up on that with the final reason I didn't like Geraldine. The beginning of the book is tense. We see the families either getting recruited by Rock or preparing for that excursion, and we know that they are going to their likely deaths, or just generally something brutal. It's dramatic because we know something is wrong, but we don't know exactly what, and we mostly want everyone to survive, except for Greg in my case. Screw that guy. Then, right after this tense setup, in Geraldine's second scene, all that tension is thrown out the window. Geraldine is an old woman who sexually abuses Rock. I'm not going to explicitly describe anything that she forces him to do, but this stuff was unbelievably gross. Then, in the following portion where Geraldine is alone, we learn the particulars of her private sexual acts and memories. This part was even grosser. Like, it made me wish I was reading Cows instead. Of course, that isn't a problem in and of itself. It's gross, but I'm reading splatterpunk. What did I expect? My actual problem with this is that it evaporates the book's tension. The first few chapters have us wondering what's going to happen at the playground, what the motivations of Rock's master are. Then, before the families even get to Geraldine's manor, Beauregard attacks the reader with the most viscerally repulsive set of chapters in the book, which fully show the depths of Geraldine's depraved mind. And suddenly, there is no tension anymore. Sure, it doesn't exactly tell us that the children are going to get vivisected by swing sets and whatnot, but it does show us that the villain is depraved and nothing is beyond her. It loosens the mystery to the mere details of the plot, like what any specific trap will do, rather than the overarching villainous scheme and how far Geraldine is likely willing to go. Playground destroys the mystery and tension by revealing way too much too early about the villain, and by making that unwanted revelation the most disgusting, shocking stuff in the entire book. And really, the descriptions here are borderline pornographic. I'm serious. If someone told me that Beauregard just took prose from an erotic novel and then changed the wording choices from sexy to vile, I would not be surprised. To me, it was sad that Playground ruined its slow burn, mystery-fueled tension so early on for what was basically an obscene version of erotica. The closest comparison I can make is with the movie Would You Rather from 2012, where a bunch of poor people are invited to the home of a rich person under innocent enough circumstances and are forced to play sadistic games against their will. Would You Rather, thus, has a very similar way of building tension, centered around our adoration for the innocent characters and our suspicion and dread surrounding what the rich person's invite will eventually entail. The villain, portrayed by Jeffrey Combs, has a similar facade to Geraldine, and we aren't initially aware of his full depravity. Now, imagine if, before the characters even get to the manor, we have a scene where Jeffrey's character participates in, I don't know, a murderous version of Two Girls, One Cup.
Iris, I would like for you to eat the...
I'm extremely sorry for that image that I just put into everyone's head, but the point is, the scene would first of all come out of nowhere, and secondly, erase the built-up tension. It's not that we believe Jeffrey Combs and Geraldine are good or not depraved. We obviously know they're probably evil, but we don't know how evil or depraved. And spiking our disgust meter so early on just removes our reactive power from the rest of the book. Everything afterwards will pale in comparison. Playground basically maxes itself out within the first 50 pages. As a reader, it felt like Playground couldn't resist shoving its most shocking scene on us too early, basically stunting the novel's development for what is little more than a pornographic absurdity. And it's even worse because there's a perfectly fantastic scene that happens right after that could have served as the book's dramatic turn, where we really start finding out how bad of a situation the characters are in. Remember Lacey's death, when she was strapped into the chair while leaning forward and the metal strap ended up going right through her neck? It's an extraordinarily shocking and tragic scene, especially because she was reaching for a bracelet that her daughter gave her when the locking mechanism killed her. It hurts and shows the audience and the characters that they are in a terrible situation. This speaks to two things. One is how well Beauregard is able to write tension and drop narrative nukes on the audience, and the second is how great and shocking the scene could have been if so much narrative weight hadn't been ejected by the preceding grotesque Geraldine stuff. Seriously, I think Beauregard is a good writer, and really could have made this book even better had he, at this juncture, chosen to prioritize narrative tension rather than a disgusting all-at-once spectacle. And Beauregard didn't even have to specifically exclude Geraldine's grossness. He could have progressively hinted at it and implied it and revealed more and more. This information about Geraldine could have been trickled out to the audience, rather than immediately shoving us into the deep end. He should have let the suspense build rather than eviscerating it immediately. One thing I really liked in the book were the environmental descriptions. The best aspect of these were the traps, which had this sleek industrial appearance, and often featured something resembling a vast pit or void beneath that the kids could fall into. It reminded me of Aperture Labs from the Portal games, specifically the second one, where you navigate the tests in these vast scientific rooms that stretch over and through these yawning, sleek industrial maws. It gave the book a liminal, dreamlike quality that I think added to the book's horror. It was like I was reading a genuine nightmare, and this is specifically why I liked the characterization so much. The characters, especially CJ and Rock, helped to keep the book grounded emotionally, and kept the nightmarish quality from becoming too overpowering. The main reason I was happy with the book was that, in my opinion, other than the Geraldine stuff I've already mentioned and what I will discuss soon, it easily beat the charge of being exploitative for no reason, or edgy for edginess' sake. I think it does this by having two thematic elements, one a bit more superficial and one fully fleshed out, that I really appreciated and were pretty integral to the novel. The first idea or theme of the book is one that a lot of people pick up on, and which didn't do anything for me except give me something to notice. Playground is a classic story of class conflict, where a rich person decides to torture poor people, and lures them there through the offer of money and charity. It's a timely theme and one that automatically helps us empathize with the victims, a necessity for the avoidance of the exploitative feeling. I think the more interesting theme that the book explores is that of narcissistic parenting. There are 3 parents in the book who fall cleanly into this category. First, of course, is Geraldine. Her love, if it could be even called that, is extraordinarily conditional and completely sadistic and selfish. She is unable to have biological children, so turns to adoption to further her family. The result is Rock, And while her attempt to exert her sadistic will over Rock is successful, he is nevertheless a disappointment in her eyes because of his stupidity and worthlessness, as she sees it. And Rock, sooner or later, is seen by her as little more than a tool or possession. In fact, she literally burns the word mine onto his skin and makes him relive that branding before she sexually abuses him. Eventually, Geraldine begins to notice Tanya, the daughter of Greg, as a potential surrogate. You see, the playground eventually becomes a sort of trial to select a new Borden heir, and Geraldine increasingly finds herself rooting for Tanya to win. But it's still a selfish wish, and is related to her incestuous desires and her need to wield power over others. Geraldine, as a parental figure, is unable to look past her own selfish, supremacist sexual whims. The second narcissistic parent is Caroline, the mother of Donnie. Her selfish style of parenting is clear. She is unwilling to give Donnie any autonomy. She keeps him on a leash, giving him no freedom of movement outside of her own desires, and cuts out his tongue, literally taking away his independent voice. And similar to Geraldine, Caroline burns Donnie, albeit with cigarettes. We don't get a ton of insight into Caroline because she doesn't last very long in the book, but it's clear enough that she sees her child as little more than a burdensome extension of herself, like a tumor, and has zero patience for any dissent or even differentiation. I will also quickly mention Rock, who, while not a parent himself, takes on something of a parental role with Donnie. The primary reason for this is that he sees Donnie as basically a version of himself, and while this does eventually lead to more caring and preservative actions, I would argue it is still not a case of true selfless guardianship, though it's not black and white, as he certainly sacrifices himself for Donnie's life. For me, the most interesting case, and probably the most salient one for most readers, is Greg. I've discussed him a lot already. It should be relatively clear that he's an obvious case of narcissistic parenting, in that he sees little worth in his children outside of how they contribute to the family's reputation. But for Greg, the family's reputation is entirely measured through his own desires. So family reputation for Greg amounts to Greg's reputation with those of the little Gregs he sees himself surrounded by. They are disposable, expendable Greg pawns that he is happy to move around the chessboard. So Playground definitely explores this angle of narcissistic parenting, and I actually noticed it affecting me as I read. Let me explain. As I mentioned before, the Grimleys are the first family to lose a child, and they are the family that is more obviously likable. So I was really frustrated that they were the first ones to suffer. And I noticed that, sickly, I actually began to hope one of Greg's brood would similarly perish just to even the odds. Of course, it's entirely possible that I am just morally bankrupt, but I don't think this is true, though you can feel free to disagree with me on that point. I think it's more about how Greg's narcissistic attitude and the others affect the reader. Greg, once he realized that the traps might have a winner, was immediately set upon the idea that one of his children would win, and abandoned any and all sympathy for the Grimleys, to the point of actively encouraging his children to murder the opposing family. He wants it to be a game, he wants it to be a competition, and Greg is so detestable that we want him to lose. But the only way he can lose, in his mind, is if his children die. So in my hatred of Greg's unabashed competitive villainy, I ended up inadvertently buying into his logic. Greg doesn't care if his kids are lost, because that means they weren't worth anything. So when I wished for, if I'm gonna be honest, Bobby to die next, I wasn't on Tom and Molly's side. I was really on Greg's, because I was playing into the narcissistic competition. All of that was just my own personal experience, and other readers might not have felt the same way, but I thought this was awesome. Playground not only explores narcissistic parenting, but actually tricked me into buying into its logic for a brief time, and not many books do that. Additionally, not only does it explore this theme, it offers a solution in the form of Tom and Molly. I mentioned above that Tom and Molly lose all of their children, but find it in themselves to root for Tanya and Donnie still. Obviously, unlike my own sadistic wishes, this is the moral thing to do, undoubtedly, but I still think it symbolizes something greater. Tom and Molly never once abandoned the hope that everyone will live. Their parental love is so great and so strong that it grows to encompass all of the children in the situation, in stark contrast to Greg. When they have fully experienced the devastating loss of their own children, Rather than being understandably lost in their own suffering, they continue to fight for Tanya and Donnie's sake, forming a new sort of family. This is the opposite of narcissistic parenting. It shows a love that's much more free from the blindness of the ego, and actually gives the book something of a happy ending, and a happy ending that the book actually earned at that. I really like this. It didn't need to try and feel hopeful, but it ended on a hopeful note that felt thematically coherent. That's awesome, because I normally hate hopeful endings. Those are my thoughts on why I like the book. Now I'm going to return to Geraldine. As I promised before, I'm going to dive into Geraldine's character once more for the bigger reason I didn't like her. This requires talking about how Geraldine ties into how horror has traditionally portrayed women's bodies. If that's not something you're interested in, or that you can approach with nuance, feel free to skip to the end. None of this changes my overall opinion on the book, because these upcoming criticisms have already been factored in. Playground is very fixated on Geraldine's sexuality. If you haven't read it, this might be hard to picture, but the book goes into consistent graphic detail about her gross and frequently non-consensual sexual encounters. These scenes are easily the most descriptive in the book. The prose suddenly goes up a notch. When Geraldine is on the scene, Beauregard becomes almost poetic and painfully fixated. I'm not going to quote anything, but the way her body parts are described has this hostile, contemptuous edge to it, with a lot of, spoiled meat style imagery. And yeah, I know she's a villain, she's supposed to be gross, but her sexuality isn't just one part of her. It basically is her. The visual language around her is almost entirely sexual, and it all centers on her lower body. Without Geraldine, the novel would have virtually no sexual content at all. Her body literally becomes the symbol of who she is as a villain, in the same way a Bond villain has a scar that stands in for their evil, except here the villain mark is her sexualized lower body. All of this contributes to the manner of her eventual demise. Playground is not without justice. The bad characters all get their comeuppance, and Geraldine is no exception. And because her lower body parts are the symbol of her evil, her punishment is graphically and gruesomely centered around them. On one hand, I get this. Geraldine's primary characteristics are sexual, and her entire motivation is basically sexual, so it's poetic, I guess, that her death would similarly be sexual. Also, her death is at the hands of Rock, who she has sexually abused throughout his life, so it's his one chance to turn the violence back on her. But I can't shake my distaste for this part. Even in The Slob, which also has a sexually motivated, disgusting antagonist whose genitals also symbolize his depravity, the character doesn't die through a sexualized punishment in the same way. His crimes are overtly and almost universally sexual in both intent and effect, while Geraldine's are mostly only about sexual intent. Yet she's the one whose death is framed entirely around her genitals. And while it is true that the Slob's member does get disfigured before he dies, it's not the cause of his death, and isn't the main spectacle. Geraldine's genital violence is the cause of her death, and is definitely the main spectacle. For me, this just taps into this bigger genre habit rather than some personal agenda on Beauregard's part. Horror just has a long history of reducing women, especially older women, to their sexuality and then punishing them for it, often in explicit, drawn-out ways. You see it in slashers where promiscuous women are always dying in the nude. You see it in the scary, gross, naked old lady trope. So when Playground uses the all-too-familiar, gross, sexualized older woman as its main revolting image, and centers on her specific body parts as the main source of Geraldine's corruption and eventual punishment, I just roll my eyes. If that doesn't bother you, that's totally fine. It's explicitly not a problem unique to Playground. But I think this fixation on Geraldine's sexualized body is a mistake for this specific story anyways, because it cheapens her as a villain. The book keeps honing in on her body parts as the symbol of her awfulness, and then punishes those parts specifically as a form of justice. This makes it feel like the real problem is her sexuality and body, rather than the choices that she as a human being makes. Instead of using a physical mark as a hint of inner evil, the way a Bond villain's scar might work, Playground almost seems to substitute her body for her character. She becomes less a loathsome person, and more a personification of disgusting sexuality. And that, for me, makes her less interesting and less effective as a villain. And on top of all that, these sexual details aren't really necessary to the novel. You could strip most of them out, tweak her motives a tiny bit, and almost nothing would change thematically, narratively, or emotionally. You can still have Rock's abuse story, you can still have the playground setup, nothing really changes. For me, this is the one place where Playground doesn't beat the charge of being shocking just for the sake of being shocking. It felt like those sexual elements were mainly there just to shock and appall the reader, not to deepen the story. In fact, I think they weaken the book's tension and its main villain because it makes her less effective, and that Playground would genuinely have been better off without them. Overall, despite these problems, I really liked Playground, and my only issue with it is basically with Geraldine's portrayal. Was the book spectacular? Not really, but it did what it set out to do, and it did it quite well, and it was a fun, engaging read, and gave me something to think about afterwards. I can't really ask for more from a horror book. In my first video on disturbing books, I made 2 rankings. One was based on my personal opinion of quality, and the other was on how good the book would be as an introduction to extreme horror and splatterpunk. My thoughts on the rankings have shifted somewhat, but I think I would place Playground in the middle of the pack, likely around Womb in both cases, another book that I liked overall but had some issues with. I'll probably be taking a break from Beauregard for a while though. Maybe I'll return to him someday, but there's a lot of messed up stuff you sickos have recommended, and I want to get to those first. So that's my review and critique of Playground by Aron Beauregard. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. If you've already read the book, I hope you could see where I was coming from with most of my critiques, and if you haven't read it, I hope it helps you decide whether or not to purchase it. I was initially going to do another review roundup, like 5 or 10 disturbing books, but I decided to make this a single review because I had a lot to say about this book, and the video was quickly becoming Playground, and other books too. I'll get to those other books soon. Let me know what you thought of the single book review, or if you prefer larger groupings. Also, follow me on both Goodreads and Letterboxd. I try to keep both accounts updated with all the recommendations I receive, and there's a lot of good stuff on there. I appreciate you watching. Comment whatever you want, add your questions and 10K philosophy hot takes and whatever else so that I can engage with y'all. I hope you have a nice day.